If you don't know Dr. Gordon, you should know her before you leave. She does phenomenal work. She's a phenomenal teacher. And no further ado, Dr. Fon Gordon.
Good morning. So my topic today is the automobile in Florida. Oh, can you hear me?
It's on.
Hello, can you hear me? What?
Not on the microphone.
I'm sorry?
Not on the microphone.
Oh. So good morning again, and I'm Fon Gordon, and I'm in the History Department here at UCF, and my topic today is the automobile in Florida, 1904 to 1934. This is part of an ongoing research project that I'm working on. The rise of the automobile in American culture coincided with the 20th century. Although automobiles shared inadequate roads with horses and other livestock, and fuel permutations included gasoline, steam power, and electricity, there were several venues that marked their increasing popularity in American life during 1904. On 30 April, the Automobile Club of America presided over the New York City Automobile Parade. Other cities that scheduled automobile parades for the year 1904 were Boston, Buffalo, Chicago, Cleveland, and Cincinnati. The opening of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition at St. Louis was scheduled for the same Saturday in April as the New York City Automobile Parade. Interest in automobiles at the fair culminated with the American Automobile Association sponsored tour from New York City to St. Louis, scheduled from 25 July to 10 August, and was followed by Automobile Day and Parade at the fairgrounds on 12 August. Toward the end of 1904, automobile pioneer and enthusiast William Kissam Vanderbilt, Jr. inaugurated the first American International Automobile Challenge in the nation. The AAA organized the Nassau County Long Island Public Road Race scheduled for October, and Vanderbilt donated a 10½ gallon Tiffany silver cup that weighed 30 pounds. But it was in Dixie that the races at the shoreline of Ormond, Daytona Beach, Florida, reconciled the year's automobile calendar. The Florida East Coast Automobile Association, with an active membership of 40 and affiliated with the AAA, sponsored the second annual Ormond Daytona racing program in late January. The coastal site scheduled the first meeting between flyers Bernie Oldfield, the most popular auto racer of his generation and driving an American-made Winton out of Cleveland, and Vanderbilt, the great-grandson of the Commodore, who set the world's record for the fastest mile at 39 seconds in his 90-horsepower Mercedes. The triumph and significance of the Ormond Daytona Beach automobile races in 1904 was memorialized in the Vanderbilt Cup Trophy. One side of the cup read, Challenge Cup presented by W.K. Vanderbilt, Jr. to the American Automobile Association under deed of gift to be raced for yearly by cars under 1,000 kilos. The obverse side was embossed with a relief image of Vanderbilt's finest moment as the winner of the mile world speed record at Ormond Daytona Beach on 27 January. The Vanderbilt Cup was the only important road race in the country from 1904 to 1910, and it antedated the annual Memorial Day Speedway race at Indianapolis beginning in 1911. The race and trophy contributed glamour, legitimacy, and the seduction of speed to American automobility. The race and trophy also symbolized the complicated nature of American automobility as a site of ongoing sectional and political reunion, and as a site of hegemonic practices. As leisure and hospitality in the new nation arose with and relied on slavery, American automobility at the turn of the 20th century emerged within the context of domestic and foreign imperialism. Native American and Philippine reservations, Jim Crow practices that targeted Black Americans as well as Hispanic and Asian Americans, and acquisition of a colonial empire in consequence of the Spanish-American War. In his seminal collection of essays, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903 and the same year that Henry Ford organized his namesake automotive company, W.E.B. Du Bois observed that, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line," close quote. Du Bois's reading of the 20th century anticipated the United States as the first mass automobile nation and the use of automobiles to impose ideological and material boundaries. The color line is symbolic of technological modernity that required an engineered landscape. This essay then uses automobility as a strategy to examine race and leisure in Florida. I argue that the national narrative of race was a central theme in making American and Southern automobility. My argument uses historiography, public memory, autobiography, and lynching as categories of analysis. Academic studies of race and automobility include Southern histories, cultural histories of technology and race, and automobile histories. In his studies of the motor age in Atlanta, Howard L. Preston suggested that the historiography of the South had neglected the automobile. He argued that the automobile was important in the development of the modern South, along with slavery, politics, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. Kathleen Franz examined the black middle class in the 1920s and 1930s in California and their access to personal mobility and technological expertise. She argued that automobiles offered black Americans a strategy of avoiding segregated transportation and racial uplift ideology. But the construction of the open road as a technological democracy masked the discrimination and representation that positioned non-whites outside the new motor culture. In his essay, Driving While Black, Paul Gilroy suggested the automobile is at the center of American negotiations of race. Among its referents, African Americans have used cars as compensation for continued racial hierarchy. He observed that Jack Johnson's automobile challenge and loss to Barney Oldfield in October 1910 supported racial discourse in which black Americans were identified as, quote, bad drivers, close quote. Cotton Seiler suggested that the automobile was an essential part of American identity in the 20th century. He noted that automobility derived from an era of racial discrimination and continued to reproduce it. Cultural historian James J. Flink noted the caste and class dimensions of American automobility and cited automotive trade journals that reported in 1923 that, quote, illiterate, immigrant, Negro, and other families were outside the market for motorcars, close quote. These studies acknowledge the salience of race in making regional and national automobility, but they identified race as blackness. But race includes an examination of whiteness that is absent in the historiography. Grace Elizabeth Hale observed that, quote, central to the meaning of whiteness is a broad collective American silence, the denial of white as a racial identity, the denial that whiteness has a history, allows the quiet, the blankness to stand as the norm, close quote. The intersection of whiteness and automobility is unremarked. This examination of race in Florida attempts to interpret how whiteness used automobility to impose segregated boundaries. The popularity of the automobile and its concomitant landscape of highways enabled the Good Roads movement during the first decade of the 20th century. To encourage local and state interest in automobile and roads, Willis Powell, who wrote a weekly automobile column for the Tampa Daily Times, convinced his editor and his publisher to sponsor the first automobile run in Florida. The Tampa Automobile Club, established in 1906, administered the 4-day race in November 1909. The first day of the route began in Tampa to Gainesville, the second day from Gainesville to St. Augustine, from St. Augustine to Kissimmee on the third day, and on the final day from Kissimmee back to Tampa, for a total of almost 550 miles. Dudley V. Haddock wrote for the Tampa Tribune and participated in the 1909 automobile race. He remembered that the average road in Florida in 1909 was a winding sandy trail through woods and around ponds. As drivers dodged trees and water features, the sandy trails were lined with pine and palmetto roots that impeded progress as well. Automobile reliability and endurance tours and speed races tested American and foreign automobile manufacturing and demonstrated the need for better roads. Haddock suggested 55 years later that the significance of the Tampa Automobile Tour in 1909 was the real kickoff of the movement eventually responsible for the investment of hundreds of millions of dollars that have gone into Florida highways. The Florida legislature created the State Road Department in 1915, and 4 years later the department began a comprehensive road building program. At the end of 1923, the State Road Department began publication of Florida Highways, the official monthly magazine of the agency. On the 15th anniversary of the 1909 Tampa Automobile Tour in 1924, the Tampa Daily Times published a nostalgic interview with Willis Powell, who recalled, "The automobile column was a great department 15 years ago. We had thrilling stories of how Ike Kraft or Ed Bryan, as a matter of fact, was president of the Tampa Automobile Club. In any case, we had thrilling stories of how Ike Kraft or Ed Bryan ran over to Safety Harbor and back the same day. It sounded like going into darkest Africa on a bull freighter." The rhetorical sign of darkest Africa to describe the conditions of Florida's public highways used the meta-language of race that referred to the dialectic of black primitivism contrasted with white civilization and deftly reconciled the color line and automobility. The use of the trope dark continent placed black Americans outside modernity, citizenship, and civility, and as importantly, outside the technology of automobility. Stetson Kennedy, a native son and perhaps the dean of Florida literati, was born in Jacksonville in 1916. He remembered a Southern culture of race and technology in his hometown and observed what he called American apartheid in his household and in the community. Quote, "We had a black housemaid from time to time, there were black yard men around and about, and there were black delivery boys with bicycles for the grocery stores," close quote. Kennedy continued, "One of the favorite sports of my white classmates in high school was to drive by black delivery boys on their bicycles. They would drive close to them and knock them off their bikes with all the groceries, just to see them fall off." Kennedy's recollection underscored the Southern character of automobile ownership and use in the region and offered another example of how automobility accommodated the color line. In Atlanta, the automobile enabled white residents to move to restricted suburban neighborhoods outside the city, or rather outside the county, and avoid city taxes. Compared to cities outside the region, a longer period of provinciality in Jacksonville and the South enabled middle-class white youth to use the automobile to make the racial transition from adolescence to adulthood. As a rite of passage, the high school sport tested gender roles and recklessness. The use of black bodies as targets of white aggression rehearsed a popular carnival or amusement game from the early 20th century known variously as African Dip, Dunk the Nigger, and Hit the Coon. The game involved a black man who sat on a platform attached to a device which, when hit with the baseball, dropped the black man into a water tank beneath the platform. The game operator required the black man to taunt whites to encourage their paying participation in the game and thereby increase receipts. The variation of Hit the Coon involved a black man who stuck his head through a hole in a banner and white customers paid to throw baseballs at his head. These racialized carnival diversions were common throughout the nation and offered white Americans the opportunity to make whiteness both inside and outside the South. A black male labor force using bicycles, as in Jacksonville, echoed the popular means of locomotion at the turn of the 20th century in South Florida called the Afromobile. Peculiar to the Palm Beach location, the Florida East Coast Hotel Group described the device as, quote, "a wheelchair fitted with a bicycle attachment and propelled by an African guide in which one or two people may ride through the avenues. There are hundreds of these chairs always in use, and at night lighted by electric lamps, the effect is brilliant and full of action," close quote. By the turn of the 20th century, the bicycle functioned for many Americans as a transition between the horse and the automobile. Interestingly, the trope of the bicycle also cited the celebrated career of African-American Major Taylor. Cycling was the first sport in which a black American won a national title, and Taylor was an American, European, and Australian cycling champion from 1891 through 1908. Lynching, finally, was among the regional practices used to preserve racial hierarchy, and it continued to define Dixie into the 20th century. The automobile enables an additional category of analysis to examine the public and social ritual. The torture of Claude Neal occurred in the late and early morning hours of 26-27 October 1934. Neal, aged 23, was a native of Malone, Florida, and an agricultural laborer. He was arrested and charged with the rape and murder of Lola Kennedy, age 19, a local white girl. He was abducted in an automobile among a group of 3 from a jail in Brewton, Alabama, and returned across the state line into the Florida woods of Jackson County. In the meantime, a crowd of perhaps 2,000 had gathered at the Kennedy house by 7 p.m. on 26 October. A reporter noted that, quote, automobiles were parked on both sides of the road from the Kennedy home for more than a mile, close quote. In the early morning hours of 27 October, the lynchers delivered the corpse of Neal tied to the back of an automobile to the front yard of the Kennedy home. James McGovern noted that the nation's conscience began to move in sympathy against the public ritual after the Neal episode, despite the failure of a federal anti-lynching bill. The North Florida lynching of Claude Neal in 1934 and its reliance on the automobile echoed in the dragging death of James Byrd Jr. in June 1998 at Jasper, Texas. This essay has briefly considered historiography, public memory, autobiography, and lynching as sources to discern a Florida discourse of automobility and race during the first third of the 20th century. During the 30 years from 1904 to 1934, United States industry pushed the nation toward the development of the first mass automobile culture of the 20th century. Henry Ford made automobile ownership accessible, and good roads benefited from public and private funds. The 1904 automobile calendar recounted at the beginning of the essay that included the New York City Automobile Parade, the New York City to St. Louis Automobile Tour as part of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, an automobile day and parade at the fair, the inaugural Vanderbilt Cup race, and the Ormond Daytona Beach speed races celebrated American embrace of mass motorization. But these technological developments and other civilities were inscribed with racial meanings and ostensibly restricted to white civilization. Part of the American narrative is how race accompanied the development of technology and culture. Thank you. Yes, Professor Wright.
How significant was lynching as a destination event in terms of drive-in entertainment? I guess most of the students might not be old enough to remember going to drive-ins.
Right, but you said lynching, right?
But lynching, well, the idea of drive-ins were that cars would, you would come to a place in your car and watch a movie.
Right.
But then some of us have seen, like you described, images of lynchings as sort of like entertainment zones.
Right, they were spectacles, right, and certainly they were carnivalesque events in the South. Joel Williamson, in The Crucible of Race, as well as A Rage for Order, suggested that more lynchings occurred in July. And one of the reasons for that was because it was hot and there was very little to do. So that lynchings represented, right, a form of entertainment, certainly, for Southerners in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But what you see certainly in lynchings is that, and certainly they were participatory. From the late 19th century, certainly people got to lynchings by train and buggy. but certainly railroads offered excursion fairs as well as excursion runs so that as many people could attend lynchings as possible. So what you see over time, along with the decline of the railroads and the rise of the automobile and mass motorization in the United States, is the fact that as a destination, automobiles became the preferred method of getting to a lynching as opposed to the railroads. The lynching of Jesse Washington in 1916, which was known as the Waco Horror. And for my students, this lynching is recounted in the bundles text, as a matter of fact, if you will recall. But in any case, Jesse Washington is one of the first lynchings in which, while he was still alive, he was attached to the back of the car. And he met his death that way. And once the body was dead, then other indignities were inflicted on the body. But you do see this this transition from where cars were not a part of the procedure and the process to where cars became integral to the procedure and the process of lynching. For Claude Neal, the one that I used in this study, which occurred in North Florida in 1934, Claude Neal was killed first, and once the body was dead, then he was tied to the back of the automobile. And when he was delivered to the front yard of the Kennedy home, the body, he was cut from the back of the car, but then cars continued to drive over it. So the point was, with mass motorization, the car became this, whether one was alive or dead, the automobile was central to the process and procedure of lynching. Right, Professor Major.
Just in reference to that, I don't know how old these students are in the room, but I know since I've been here at UCF, the one that happened in Tampa, where they dragged the man behind the pickup truck with a chain. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, I'll have to look that one up.
Okay, I mean, it had to have been within the past 10 or so years.
Okay.
So, I mean, this is not something that happened way back in 1930s and 1900s.
Well, I did bring up James Byrd, which was in 1998. So, right, this notion of the automobile as an instrument of torture has a history, certainly through the 20th century. That's right, and you're right, it's not a new thing. But it arose at the same time with the United States as a mass automobile culture. So it's interesting. I watched Game Change over the weekend on HBO, and one of the things that the Ed Harris playing John McCain, one of the points he made was that there's a dark side to American populism, and certainly you can see that in the popularity of the automobile. There's a dark side to the history and popularity of American automobility that is not always acknowledged.
And how much truth or myth is it about the word picnic? I heard that that's where the word picnic came from, was what he was saying was driving in July, and they would have these picnics,
right, in which you picked a nigger.
Right.
Well, I don't know. I mean, certainly that seems reasonable, given the history of race, given our national narrative of race. But if indeed that originated in the 19th century, it originated before the automobile. So.
Right.
And at this point, I'm only interested in the automobile. Yes.
You mentioned the race between Jack Johnson and Barney Oak.
Yes, in October of 1910. Yes.
Was there, I know NASCAR has, I guess in bring more minority representation, not only into the stands but also into the races.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the legacy of Willie T. Gibbs. I think he was a NASCAR driver in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
And we heard recently about how the segregation in American sports really didn't begin to take off until the 1920s and 1930s, where the African Americans.
Oh no, the segregation in American sport began before then, because it was difficult for Major Taylor. While he did certainly compete in the United States, as I said, between 1898 and 1908, that was always fraught with tension. And certainly LAW, which was the League of American Wheelmen, which was a cycling organization. Okay, it predated AAA. Okay, the American Automobile Association. The League of American Wheelmen was an all-white organization, despite the fact that probably the most famous cyclist among them was Major Taylor. Yes?
I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly. You said that a lot of the carnival events that we have now kind of started with them making a spectacle of black people.
Yes.
What time in our history was that?
Turn of the 20th century. And even before, the whole notion of a midway began in 1876 in Philadelphia at the centennial celebration, the 100th anniversary of the United States. But it was outside of the fairgrounds. By the time of the White City, which is what the World's Columbian Exposition at Chicago in 1893, it was called the White City because theoretically all of the buildings were made of white marble. But at the same time, it also underscored the age of Jim Crow. So that was another reason why it was called the White City. But in any case, it was at Chicago in 1893 that, because so much money had been made by the Midway in 1876, even though it was not a part of the fair, then the Midway became a part of the fair, beginning with the Chicago Exposition of 1893. And from then on, between 1876 to 1916, certainly at expositions, but as part of carnivals and state fairs, the same kinds of attractions that were popular at the expositions became popular at amusement parks and state fairs and carnivals, those kinds of things. And so what you had in 1876, as an example, was a sideshow that was referred to as the Old Plantation, in which African Americans were theoretically, even though this was, almost the end of Reconstruction, the idea was they were happily reconstructing a southern plantation and their enslavement. And that continued throughout the 20th century, or at least until World War II. And as a variation of that, the Old Plantation, then you had these other games in which the black body was a target. So if there are no other questions, thank you very much for your attendance and attention.